Hello, and welcome to Message in the Middle with Marianne. We all know that life is hard, right? It's messy, it's unpredictable, but it can be wonderful all at the same time. My hope is that we can take a deep dive into self-development topics and explore life's lessons through book clubs, conversations, and interviews. And together, we can uncover the lessons that others have already learned to help us navigate this crazy, wonderful ride called life. Hello and welcome to Message in the Middle. I'm your host, Marianne, and today I'm having a conversation with Dr. Sarah Ballantyne. We're going to explore the role nutrients play in our diet, why most people aren't getting enough of the essential nutrients they need, and how we can make some small, impactful changes while still eating what we enjoy. And I'm also hoping to pull out a few core life lessons as well. Before we dig into that, though, let me introduce Dr. Sarah Ballantyne. Dr. Sarah has a PhD and is the founder of Nutrivore.com and the New York Times bestselling author of Nutrivore, the radical new science for getting the nutrients you need from the food you eat. She creates educational resources informed by the most current evidence-backed scientific research to help people improve their day-to-day diet and lifestyle choices. With Nutrivore, Dr. Sarah has created a positive and inclusive approach to dietary guidance based in science, using nutrient density and sufficiency as its basic principles. It's about nourishment, not judgment. Dr. Sarah, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's jump right in, because the first question everybody's probably wondering is the same one I was wondering. What exactly is Nutrivore? Is it a diet? Is it a culture? Is it a whole educational thing? What is it?
I have never thought of it in the term of culture before. And you just asking me that question is giving me like a whole like epiphanistic moment of like, that's maybe the better way to talk about it. I describe Nutrivore as a dietary philosophy. So it's somewhere in between diet and anti-diet. So we're looking at adopting lifelong healthy habits to improve our overall eating patterns. So we're looking at choosing foods that offer a lot of nutrients. We're actually meeting our nutritional needs from the foods we eat, but in a permissive way. So with no food restrictions, no food off the table. So we are not dieting, right? We're not doing that like on again, off again diet roller coaster. We're not depriving ourselves of the foods we love. If anything, we're leaning into those foods as really valuable tools to make sure that we're getting enough joy from our diet that we can maintain those overall healthy eating patterns for the rest of our lives. So because of it kind of pulls from both the world of diet and anti-diet, it's sort of awkwardly in the middle, which is why I refer to it as the dietary philosophy, but maybe it's a diet culture. Oh, except that diet culture is a different thing.
Yeah.
Maybe I can't use that word, but it is about increasing our knowledge base, what nutrients do in the body. There's 49 essential nutrients. We're so often taught, right? Like do this one thing, right? Count this one thing, cut out this group of foods, right? Do this. It's so simple. All you have to do is insert thing that is restriction and food fear, and then it'll be magical, sunshine, unicorns, and rainbows, right? Like these like huge promises for cutting out one thing. But like you can't distill what a healthy diet looks like to one thing because there's 49 essential nutrients and because we're biologically complex. That doesn't mean that eating a long-term health supporting diet is complex, but it does kind of mean like looking at bigger patterns rather than counting one thing. So Nutrivore is about expanding that base knowledge so that we understand the value of those patterns, and that makes it easier to adopt.
Let's talk about that. You used the word complex while saying it doesn't have to be complex.
Mm-hmm.
You also talked about it being more additive than take away, which
Yes.
I think is a new trend I hear out there all the time now. And I actually love it. I can get completely on board with that. So kind of put those two things together, and what might that look like? Like break it down into simple terms for us on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. So if it's additive, I can keep my ice cream in, I'll say, and my potato chips. Everybody knows those are the two things I always have an issue with. So we can keep those in, though, you're saying.
Yes.
But we can do what then to make sure? How do we make it simple? How do we not worry about 48 nutrients?
49. 49 essential nutrients.
49. I missed one.
And I'll say the 50th is joy.
I love that. How do we make sure we are not then obsessing over, did I get all 49 of these nutrients?
Yeah. So I've created a lot of tools to kind of simplify those eating patterns and make them a little bit formulaic, because we've learned, like, every diet teaches us mostly something wrong about food, right? Like, and if you're like me, like, I think I've done every diet at some point in my life, right? I've been around, been around the block a few times. So yes, I've been around for a long time. So I've been around to see a lot of different fad diets come and go. And so I think, if you look back, this like huge amount of misinformation about what a healthy diet looks like really goes back to like the 50s and 60s, really took off in the 70s. So we're now looking at 3, 4, 5 generations of people who have been learning things that are incorrect about what healthy eating patterns are. And so we kind of need to like relearn what those look like so that we can eat a full of nutrition diet more intuitively. So I think a great place to start is just like what a balanced meal looks like. Like, if I'm picking foods that I'm filling my plate this way, that's going to get me a long ways down the road towards meeting my nutritional needs. So that would be choosing more whole foods using the loosest possible definition of whole foods. So we are counting canned green beans. We're counting whole wheat bread. We're counting cheese. We're counting all of those frozen fruits and vegetables. We are using the loosest possible definition. If you could have made it at home, it counts as a whole food. Okay. You don't have to make it at home, but if you could have, like, we can make cheese. It's labor intensive. I'm sure there are some people who that's like a fun hobby, but I'm not interested. But using that like very loose definition of what a whole food is. So mostly whole foods prepared in ways that we enjoy. We're going to come back to that. And then just think about your plate as having 3 sections.
Okay.
So we're going to break it up into a quarter, and a half. So one of those quarters is your protein food. That could be meat, that could be fish, that could be eggs, that could be dairy products, that could be a plant protein, that could be bone broth. So it's just, that's your protein serving. A quarter of your plate is your starch. So ideally, this would be a whole food starch, like a whole grain or legumes or a root vegetable. But, like if it's white rice, if it's bread, right? That's all counts in that quarter of the plate. And then the other half of the plate is fruits and vegetables. Fruit, it means sweet fruit. Like, fruit means apples and bananas and grapes and pineapple. Vegetables includes tomatoes and cucumber and squash and like all of those things that are botanically fruit. So we're using the culinary definitions. And if you would rather have your fruit as a snack, right, or as a dessert, that's fine. You don't have to have it on your plate. Then you can have half of your plate be vegetables if that's your preference. I love adding fruit to a salad.
Yeah.
Or like fruit salsas with fish, especially. I love that. Or chutneys, right?
Chicken.
Yeah, a little cranberry sauce. That counts as my fruit section of my plate for sure. So just kind of getting into like, that's the pattern. And now it doesn't need to be laid out that way. So if you're making like a taco salad bowl, right? Like your starch is going to be, well, if it's a plant-based option, then your protein and your starch can be your beans. Or you might have, chicken or beef or something might be your protein. Your beans can then count as your starch, kind of counts towards both. You could have some tortillas, right? Corn chips or something like that is counting as your starch. And then you've got your lettuce and cucumber and guacamole and tomatoes, like all of those vegetables. And that even gives you sort of the sense of like, even if I'm making this as kind of a mixed meal, what's the proportion? If I'm making soup or stew, thinking of it in that same like half vegetables, a quarter protein, a quarter starch. And like that starch might also be a vegetable.
Yeah.
Right. So we're going to just put sweet potatoes over in that starch part. So in that case, then it's 3/4 vegetables, right? And just kind of getting used to that being most meals, not every meal. Please, not every meal. Sometimes just eat pizza. It's okay. Right?
Yes, I love that.
But more meals kind of having that composition that gets us eating more whole foods, right? That gets us upping our fruit and vegetable intake. The more variety, the better. Like the more we just mix it up and like, man, I'm sick of broccoli, so now I'm going to eat green beans.
Yeah.
I'm sick of green beans and I'm going to do some steamed asparagus. Asparagus is in season. It's the spring, right? Like the more we can do that, the more we can mix it up, the better. And then most importantly, the number one most important thing here is to prepare all of the foods on your plate in ways that you find tasty. So if that means put salad dressing on your salad, put salad dressing on your salad. If that means roast those vegetables, right? If that means adding a ton of seasonings to your foods, like do that. So like cater to your tastes. So now we've created a meal that is balanced. You've got your protein, your fiber, your slow burning carbohydrates. You've got tons of vitamins and minerals and phytonutrients in this plate. It's nutrient dense. So it's going to be filling. It's going to be very nourishing. And because we've prepared it in ways that cater to our own flavor preferences, it's going to be satisfying. Now let's make 3 meals a day like this too. Let's not skip meals. Let's eat breakfast, right? Like, so another thing that really, I think, drives feeling of not having control is buying into all of the propaganda around intermittent fasting and thinking that skipping breakfast is a good thing. When for most people, skipping breakfast just makes us more unregulated later in the day and actually worsens blood sugar regulation, increases stress, right? So for most of us, breakfast is a really important health supporting habit. There's always exceptions. There's some people who it just super works for, and I don't want to take that away if you're one of them.
Yeah.
But I think for most of us, eating breakfast, and breakfast is kind of a hard meal to craft this way. So maybe think of it as some kind of protein, some kind of starch, and maybe a fruit, right? Fruit's a little bit easier for breakfast, right? So berries and Greek yogurt and some granola.
Yeah, super easy.
Right? Would be a great one. Easy to do as a smoothie, eggs and a piece of fruit. Thinking about it that way, or eggs and a piece of toast and a piece of fruit, right? Like it can be super simple. But when you're starting from a place of you've had enough food, right? When you craft your meals this way, you can typically meet your nutritional needs within about half to 3/4 of your caloric requirements, depending on what exactly your energy requirements are, how active you are, et cetera. So you're eating filling, nourishing, and satisfying meals. You've eaten enough food throughout the day, so you're not getting to 7 p.m. and you're super hangry. And you're starting from a place where like, yeah, I'm full.
Yeah.
I'm nourished. I'm satisfied. So now if I'm having ice cream for dessert, or maybe I'm throwing maybe the potato chips were my starchy food. Maybe that was my quarter of the plate. Like I do that in my family. I do sometimes serve potato chips as our starchy food.
I love that.
We eat dessert often because dessert is my quality of life food. But when you start from this place of, I liked my meal, I've eaten enough food, I've gotten all of my nutrients, and then I've given myself full permission to eat this ice cream or these chips. Even initially, if you come from restriction, you may still overdo like those foods that you used to think of as bad, right? Like I shouldn't eat these.
Yes.
There is kind of a transition period where you're like, wait, I can eat ice cream? Well, can I eat the whole pint? And I still think that's okay. That transition period is really important to get to the other side where that food is just part of your normal routine and it's a delightful part of your day, but it doesn't need to be this like big thing where you feel like you don't have control. So other things that can help that sort of feeling of that like compulsion to keep going as somebody who comes from a very disordered eating past. Other things that help a lot is getting a little bit more sleep and getting some low strain activity like walking. It makes such a huge difference.
Yeah.
But Nutrivore is like, you can see, right, where the Nutrivore principles are, right? It's very much like, what are these foods to put on my plate? How to balance the different types of food so I'm getting the full range of nutrients that I need. And then how to get away from that feeling of deprivation. Because when we deprive ourselves of our favorite foods,
We want them more.
or comfort foods, traditional foods, cultural foods, or when we fear foods, right? We think, oh, that's the food that made me sick, or that's the food that made me fat, or that's the food that, is killing our children, right? Like there's so much food fear on the internet.
Yeah.
That actually increases food fixation and obsession. So we feel like the food's calling our name. That magnifies cravings. And that actually makes us more susceptible to emotional eating and disordered eating patterns. So it makes us more susceptible to, I had a bad day. Okay, now I'm eating this food that I told myself I shouldn't. And now I don't feel like I have control, right? Now I'm like way overeating this food. And so all of that is like the natural psychological consequence of restriction, which is why I say Nutrivore leans more towards anti-diet than diet. It's about understanding those long-term healthy eating patterns, but getting away from that restrictive mindset that is making it impossible to stick to like whatever it is you're trying to stick to, right? Like it doesn't matter how healthy of a diet I craft for you. If you're not getting joy from that diet, if you feel like you're missing your favorite foods, you can't stick to it. Like it's just, it is, we are hardwired to make that impossible.
It's not sustainable. I was going to go here towards the end. I wanted to dig in more around the nutrients. So we'll come back, but I'm going to take a short side cut because you've alluded to it. And if people love this conversation, they may do some research on you and they may find that you're now in a different position than you were. Your talk track is different than it was years ago.
Yes.
I personally love that because it means, well, I'm going to let you talk about what it means, but I think we should probably just expose that elephant in the room if they, if they stumble across that, because all of the things that you're saying, I'm so in alignment with. But this wasn't always where you sat. And I think it's important because some people still sit on the other, I'll say on the other side of the fence or in the other position. Talk to us a little bit about that shift for you, what that looked like, what your previous life was and sort of how you got here. Tell us a little bit about that.
So I found my voice in the sort of wellness community, health conscious communities at large through promoting restrictive dieting and food fear. And I wish I could say there was like one aha moment where I just was like, oh man, I've got this all wrong. But there wasn't. There wasn't just one moment. It was more of a culmination of small realizations. So it started, I think it was 2016, 2015, maybe. I started working on a book about the gut microbiome and that I ended up walking away from that project in 2020. I don't know if I'll ever go back to it. But as a science communicator, I'm like, okay, cool. Gut microbiome is interesting. I don't know a whole lot. I got to go now read the science and, learn about this so that I can write about it.
Yeah.
And communicate about it. And so I did like the science communicator thing. I'm going to go read everything I can. And I kept being confronted with studies showing me the immense health value of a food that I had been restricting and that I had been telling other people not to eat. And I was like, well, I know how fundamental the gut microbiome is for our overall health, right? The gut microbiome influences every system in the body, and there's a tie between every chronic illness and some kind of gut microbiome shenanigans, right? Like the wrong kinds of bacteria or some kind of bad metabolic byproduct or a lack of dietary or of a gut microbial diversity, which comes from low dietary diversity, right? So like those links are really compelling. And so if I'm looking at lentils was the first food, and I had been avoiding them because of the lectins. And I was like, oh, but look at how fantastic lentils are for the gut microbiome. I'm not eating lentils, but like, if they're this good for the gut microbiome, they've got to be good for us, right? And I slowly, food at a time, and then like convinced myself to try them, found they worked out just fine. So I was like slowly facing my food fears and realizing that I had a learned eating disorder that I had learned through a restrictive dietary template, that I was promoting food fear through a logical fallacy, right? So I had really bought into, and I learned this from other scientists and doctors when I was coming into the wellness community, that if a food has something in it that is inflammatory or interferes with the hormone system, that means that that's a bad food. But in reality, we're biologically complex. So are all the foods we eat. Like they're all made up of many different chemicals and many different nutrients. And the vast majority of the time, even if there's something in that food that might not work really well with one biological system, we are compensated with many other compounds, many nutrients that improve that system, right? So if you think about like one compound in a food, the lectins and lentils that are inflammatory, but meanwhile, lentils are one of the densest sources of polyphenols, which are extremely anti-inflammatory. They're a good source of B vitamins, of vitamin E, which help to reduce inflammation. They're some of our most mineral dense foods, right? Like we're getting so much, and great sources of fiber, and fiber reduces inflammation, right? So there's so many other things in that food that are having a positive effect. So you kind of weigh the two against each other. So you can't just say, oh, this thing has this thing and that's bad. You have to look at the composition of the whole food and how eating that whole food on a regular basis impacts the whole body. And that was like the missing the forest for the trees, like way that I had been thinking about food and had been taught to think about food. And so my research into the gut microbiome was my pathway back to evidence-based recommendations. I realized pretty soon that my diet and my thought process did not align with the restrictive diet brand that I had previously associated myself with. And I realized it was time to move on. And I decided to rebrand, but not just that, to create something new because of my experience in the wellness community and this like spread of food fear. And what happens with the food fear is people are restricting so many different foods that they're digging really deep nutritional holes. And it's actually maybe trading some kind of like short-term benefit for long-term health harm because of those nutritional deficiencies. And so for me, Nutrivore started off as a way to talk about the value of nutrients to communities following restrictive diets that I used to belong to, and then has evolved over the last 4 years into its sort of whole own thing and actually moving way beyond restriction. And it's worth noting the way that I got into this in the first place is having lost 100 or more pounds 3 times in my life, having been obese and very ill in my teens, in my 20s, in my 30s. And the experience of dieting, yo-yo dieting, of dealing with a lot of symptoms of chronic illness, of going to the doctor because of symptoms of chronic illness and just being told, oh, you just need to lose weight.
Yeah.
Of being the subject of weight discrimination and weight stigma in society. I think that is what made me very susceptible to, thinking about foods in this incorrect way in the first place. It made me very susceptible to the allure of restrictive dietings, right? Cut out this thing, sunshine, rainbows, and unicorns.
Yeah.
And the fact is that, it's been a many years transition for me back to my scientific research roots and evidence-based recommendations. And Nutrivore is the approach to food that has allowed me to finally actually nail that like healthy diet, and I still eat the foods that I love.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, it has been the path to really like healing my relationship with food, and really some therapy helped here too. Let's not ignore the value of my therapist in this whole process, but really addressing those disordered eating patterns and the thought processes behind them. And so you can see that the experience of realizing that I was wrong about really key nutritional concepts and then having to admit that and communicate that to 1 million people online, not a great feeling, but also realizing that we are all susceptible to misinformation.
Yes.
Because it preys on our insecurities, our fears, it feeds them. And because of that, anybody can find themselves on the wrong side of a nutrition topic. And so you'll also see in my resources a very, very high level of scientific rigor, a lot of citations, really examining the quality of the studies that I cite, and also communicating those concepts with compassion and understanding. I understand how seed oils have become this like toxic boogeyman on the internet.
Yeah.
I used to believe that.
Yeah.
And it's taken a huge amount of research for me to really convince myself of the fact that those are myths, and like they really are completely not only incorrect, but like the opposite of the truth. Like vegetable oils are actually health promoting. And so to communicate that, I have a very, very long, rigorous review article on my website, but then I've also done a huge amount of video content because I understand the complex emotions that go into being susceptible to a myth like that, right? We want an easy solution, right? We want an easy thing to blame. We have a lot of distrust of industry, of corporations, of government regulatory agencies. All of that feeds into that conversation. And the science, there's like this like scientific seed of truth, right? Like this one pathway that's inflammatory that you can like which is how I used to believe it, right? Where you can like you just build up the Legos and you see, haha, vegetable oils leads to inflammation.
Sure.
But you never hear anybody talking about the alternate biological pathway for these fats that turns into an anti-inflammatory signal for the body. And that's why when you look at these like actual clinical trials in humans, that you see like a neutral or slightly anti-inflammatory effect of these oils. They influence our cardiovascular disease risk factors in some other ways that don't have to do with inflammation, which is pretty cool. So that communication just kind of requires scientific rigor, right? We got to talk about dihomogamma-linolenic acid because it's so cool.
Right. And the average person isn't going to do that, right? I mean,
But then we also have to say like, yeah, I get it. Like I understand that food fear. Even when I had been doing this research and talked myself into, I've got to add these back into my diet. My fears are unfounded. It still took me months to go buy canola oil. And then it sat in my pantry for 3 months before I actually cooked with it, even though I had read all the science showing me that canola oil is equally as health beneficial as olive oil. Like it was still such a hard one for me to like get over because that fear just ran so deep. And so I really understand. I understand the experience of like just how uncomfortable it is to be learning something that conflicts with what we held to be true.
Yeah.
And how hard it is to then take action on that information. And so that is also wrapped up into my communication and just like how I frame everything, I talk about foods very, very positively, but also very gently.
So relatable. I mean, that story for most of the listeners is going to be so relatable because many of them have history that mirrors your path of, especially the yo-yo dieting and just trying to figure out this whole wellness train that we're all striving for. But it's so challenging to discern the right information that's out there, especially if you don't have the scientific rigor or the capability to perform that kind of rigor, right? Which the average person doesn't. I mean, we're all great at something, but not that. So, everybody's going to really relate to that. And I really wanted to bring it there, because I'm all about talking about transition and life lessons and getting in alignment with our real true core values and who we are. And as you were telling that story and I'm looking at your face and your whole demeanor shifted and I could tell you probably were in it back then and very passionate about it. I didn't know you then, but I can tell that you feel very aligned right now with your message and with who you are. And I also can feel how that transition must have been very, very difficult.
Oh, yeah.
So it's worth putting it out there.
It's hard to admit to your spouse that you're wrong.
Never mind the world.
It's hard to admit, never mind like the whole world.
Yeah.
And, I had this choice of like doubling down and ignoring.
Yeah. Which you could have.
In front of me.
You could have got away with that.
And I've seen a lot of people do that. I could have just disappeared into obscurity, lived off of,
whatever you had done in the
right? Like it would have been fine. I've got lots of skills. I could have found another job. I chose the harder path of admitting that I was wrong, explaining how I got to be wrong in the first place and how I made that realization.
Yeah.
And like where the correct information is, and bringing my audience along with me, because my goal this whole time has been to help people. I was wrong about a lot of stuff. I taught a lot of people wrong things, which feels terrible. But I didn't know I was wrong. Right. I thought I was doing a good thing. I thought I was helping people. And I wasn't wrong about everything. There were still lots of things that I taught people that were right and that really did legit help people. But that realization of being wrong, to me, I felt like a moral imperative. Like if my goal is to help people, the way to help them is to correct what I got wrong and help them make this similar transition away from disordered eating patterns. Like we can still talk about diet quality and nutrients, which is something I've been nerdy about for a very, very long time. We can still talk about lifestyle factors, something I've also been nerdy about for a very long time. But now we can do this in this way that is ditching our food fears rather than expanding them. And even though it has been confronted with a lot of anger, accusations, every time I talk about vegetable oil, somebody says like, who's paying you? You're a sellout, right? Like there's all the conspiracy of, what big company is giving me what. And so there's been like both the really personal discomfort
Yeah.
of having to face that information,
That's growth.
integrate it.
That's growth. That's growth. Huge growth.
But then, yeah. And then having to do it all over again when I communicated online and have to like hold people's hands through that same transition and then have some people just slap my hand away and just be like, no, I don't want to.
Yeah.
But I think that, we're in a world right now where there's more misinformation about nutrition and diet online than there is good information.
Yeah.
And I think that modeling and showing like the full raw, because this whole transition took place in public. Like my long-term followers saw all of this happen piece by piece over years. Modeling that transition, I think, is a really important thing to do.
Me too.
Because it shows people how to kind of get out of their little confirmation bias bubbles of safety.
Yes.
It's very uncomfortable. It doesn't feel good. But on the other side, when you can just have that like realization of like, oh my gosh, yeah, I was wrong. There is a sense of, okay, first it's almost like grief, right?
Yeah.
First, there's a sense of feeling betrayed, right? Like, oh, you taught me that wrong thing. That person that I have this parasocial relationship with that I look up to led me astray.
Yes.
And then there's this feeling of regret. Like for me, it's like, how much money did I spend on more expensive groceries that I didn't need to be buying? Oh my gosh. There's that like that sort of bit of anger.
Yeah.
But then there's this sense of, I don't want to say peace. It's not quite that. There's just a feeling of like being on the right side.
Mm-hmm.
And the confidence and comfort that comes with that knowledge that's different. It's different when you are in the midst of believing misinformation, where you have confidence, but it's sort of like a false confidence. And you don't really see how fragile the confidence is until you have that deeper information on the other side. And so there's just a sense of like, this is right. And there are a lot of like negative, complex emotions before you get to that. I guess the equivalent would be the acceptance stage of grief.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But and that's why I sort of refer to talking about this as like a moral imperative, because that's how it has felt, right? I felt just as much as I felt like I wanted to help people. Now I feel like I have to do this in order to truly help people.
I love that. Two of my very favorite quotes are so much just coming to mind. The first is, our mess becomes our message. And I hate to call it a mess, but I do think that our biggest life lessons, it's really what why I brought this whole show together. What our life lessons become a message to so many other people and can help so many other people. So congratulations, I think, on that, because you're taking your mess and you're helping people with the message.
Congratulations on being messy.
We're all messy. It's life is messy. And then the second thing is a Maya Angelou quote that I just love, and I've had to learn myself, and I'll probably get it slightly wrong, but basically it says that we do the best we can with the information we have at the time. Yeah. And when we know more, we do better. And so I've dealt with and talked openly about things that I've done in my life that I wish I did differently or better or had more information. And some of them are near and dear to my heart, like raising my children. They're grown now. You can't go back. You can't undo it, and you can't get stuck in the grief or you just can't get hung up on beating yourself up on it over and over and over. You have to let it go. You have to make peace with it and understand that you really did do the best you could at the time with what you knew. And now you know more, and now you do better. And so I just put that out there because I think it's fantastic for people. I know this wasn't exactly the conversation we were here to talk about, but it's great for people to see the transparency and the authenticity of real life. This is real life. This is everybody. Yeah. This isn't just them going through something. Like, we all have these transformations and these challenges in life, and it's how you get out of them and how you recover on the other side that really makes us who we are. And so I think it's worth talking about. So thank you for sharing that story. I do want to go back because I think it's important to talk about the nutrient complexities of our diet.
Yeah.
I know you talk about the fact that most of us, and I won't get the number, quote, or whatever, right? But most of us, you don't think, I'm putting words in your mouth, are getting the nutrients we need.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
We've got a fairly large collection of scientific studies now that look at the foods that people are eating and do these calculations. They go, okay, like give me a food journal for 3 days or for 7 days, right? And now we're going to total up all of the nutrients in all of the foods that you ate, and we're going to see what nutrients you fell short of, right? Like it's a pretty simple way to approach this. And then some studies will like differentiate out fortification. Some studies will differentiate out a multivitamin, right? Like, and so there's like we'll have slightly different populations. But there is a 2011 study that I think did a particularly rigorous job of this. So it's usually my go-to for quoting statistics. And this study, granted, they didn't look at all 49 essential nutrients. I think they looked at 20 some odd. But out of the nutrients that they looked at, they showed that there were 4 essential nutrients for which 90% or more of Americans never get enough of from their diets. So vitamin D, I think we can maybe put in a little separate bucket because we also make it from the sun. We don't necessarily have to get it from the diets, right? So really only like 75% of us are insufficient or deficient in vitamin D. So maybe we kind of put vitamin D aside. But 98% of us don't get enough potassium. 96% of us don't get enough vitamin E, which is the main fat-soluble antioxidant in our diets. And about 90% of us don't get enough folate, vitamin B9, even though that's like in fortified foods.
Yeah.
And we're still hitting 90% of us don't get enough. And then there's 10 essential nutrients for which half or more of us don't get enough from our foods.
Wow.
And like the study doesn't even look at like fiber. That's still about 90% of us don't get enough. There's like a lot of other nutrients that the study didn't even include. So I think, if I were to pick and choose, which I don't think is very scientific to do, but if I was to pick and choose like the worst statistics from all of the different papers, I could make this look even more dire, but I don't have to. That's 10 essential nutrients that half or more of Americans never get enough of from our diets. And the reason why that's a problem is it's not like we all have scurvy, right? Like it's not a nutrient deficiency. It's not causing a disease of malnutrition. It's a nutrient shortfall, which means it's somewhere in between so low intake that it causes malnutrition. Since I mentioned scurvy, so for scurvy, you only need 10 milligrams of vitamin C per day to not get scurvy. But the recommended dietary intake for vitamin C is 75 milligrams for adult females and 90 milligrams for adult males.
It's a big window.
So most of us are somewhere in between, right? We don't have scurvy. It's fine. Our teeth are staying in our mouth. It's great, right? But we're still not hitting that 75 or 90 milligrams. So it's this weird gray where the way it can make you feel on a day-to-day basis is tired, maybe more easily stressed, especially vitamin C. Vitamin C is a really big one for our stress responses. Maybe a little bit headachy, maybe not sleep so well, maybe have a little joint pain or a little muscle pain, maybe just kind of feel bleh, like maybe get every cold that your preschooler brings home, or maybe not really like have any obvious symptoms, but it increases the risk. So everything that can go wrong with us health-wise, other than heritable genetic diseases, is linked to our nutrition, is linked to nutrients. And that's because nutrients are raw materials, right? They're not just the building blocks of everything that makes us, but they're all of the input into all of the chemical reactions of life. So everything that every cell has to do in order to be able to do its job requires nutrients, not just energy, like definitely also energy, but vitamins and minerals and amino acids and fatty acids. So like all of these 49 essential nutrients are required for us to just be us, for all of our biological systems to do what they do. And so when we don't give our bodies the nutritional resources they need, that creates this strain on those systems, right? Strain on the cardiovascular system, strain on the immune system, strain on our detoxification pathways, strain on our neurological system or on our bones. And that then interacts with other risk factors. So our lifestyle, our other health-related behaviors, like whether or not we smoke or drink, our genetics, our social determinants of health, stuff we have no control over, right? Things like socioeconomic class, which is a big contributor to health outcomes. And it all together then increases our risk for cardiovascular disease, cancer, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, chronic kidney disease, osteoporosis, osteoarthritis, et cetera, et cetera. So fixing the nutrition piece, right? Getting all of the nutrients that our bodies need from the foods we eat, it's not a cure. It's not a food is medicine, because there's all these other things that are controlling health outcomes that we have no control over. So diet plus lifestyle plus health-related behaviors accounts for 40 to 50% of health outcomes, which means there's 50 to 60% of stuff we can't control. Access to medical care, right?
That's a big deal. Yeah.
Our social determinants of health, our genetics.
Yeah.
But 40 to 50% is still huge. That's a big deal. That is worthwhile putting in the effort. And so when we can up our nutrient intake by just understanding where nutrients are coming from and, you know, what they even do, we can dramatically reduce our risk of health problems as we age, right? So this is really looking at long-term health. Very often, this can also help to alleviate symptoms, right? Very often it can make us feel better in the short term as well. But really, you know, to motivate these decisions, we're looking at what is my life going to be like as I age, right? Am I going to be able to be independent?
Yeah.
Am I going to be able to be active? Am I going to have a functioning body? Am I going to be burdened with disease, right? So how do I have the highest quality life, right? The longest health span, in addition to living a long time. And that's where understanding the value of nutrients really comes to play.
What do you say to people that say, well, I take my vitamins.
Oh.
So sure, I don't get it in my diet, but so what? I get all those things through my, fortified vitamins.
Yeah. So I don't want to, it's kind of hard to answer this question and not sound anti-supplement. So I'm just going to give the caveat that I'm not anti-supplement. There's definitely a time and a place, but we have these huge studies now, so much so that we have multiple systematic reviews and meta-analyses where they pool together data from a bunch of different studies, even one just published earlier this year, that show that taking a daily multivitamin does not cause improvements to health outcomes the way we would expect, right? So we see reductions in essential nutrient intake increases risk of, say, cardiovascular disease, cancer, all-cause mortality, which is a general indicator of health and longevity used in these studies just to see if something is good or bad for us overall. And we go, okay, so people who take a daily multivitamin, what are their rates of cardiovascular disease or cancer or death from those things, right? Compared to the person who doesn't. There's no difference. There's no difference, at least in these big outcomes. Again, there might be some niche things, right? B complex vitamins have been shown to improve cognition in older adults, right? So there's smaller places where we can still make a case for maybe taking a multivitamin. But if we were utilizing those nutrients the same way as we do when we get them from food, we would expect to see a signal. We would expect to see at least all-cause mortality, right? This is such a broad, general way of measuring if something is good or bad. And we're seeing nothing. We're seeing no change. What's interesting is there's a lot of possible explanations for this, but no concrete answers. So if you say well, why? Why doesn't a multivitamin improve health?
Yeah.
It could be that they just take too long to dissolve in our digestive tracts. So a lot of the nutrients they contain, the receptors for those and transporters to bring them into our body are higher up. They're in the small intestine. And a lot of especially tablets don't even fully dissolve until the large intestine, if they fully dissolve in our digestive tracts at all. So we might not be absorbing them. They might be just taking a trip on the way through, just taking the bypass. It could be that it's not enough, that our diets are so nutritionally poor that we're just not making up enough difference with a multivitamin. There's also, multivitamin supplements tend to have a bunch of vitamins and minerals. There's a lot of other really important nutrients that impact health that aren't formulated into those, right? So we don't have fiber in them. We don't have protein in them. We typically don't have enough phytonutrients to make a big difference. So it could just be that there's other nutrients that a multivitamin is not making the shortfall up in. It could be that oftentimes you're just taking it on an empty stomach and we need efficient digestion to be able to absorb that. So taking it with a meal might be the solution.
Better.
It could, right? So maybe
we don't know.
It's better.
We don't know.
And it's probably a mix of all of the above, right? It's probably a little bit of everything. But there was a study done in 2019 that actually got in there really into the data and said, okay, if this nutrient comes from food, does it change health outcomes? And if it comes from a supplement, does it change health outcomes? And they were able to show, they have the long list of supplements that when it comes from food, but not supplements, you get the expected health benefits. And there was calcium that actually had a very slight, I'm not saying avoid your calcium supplements if your doctor has said to take calcium, But calcium supplementation, when you got over the daily value, that actually had a slight tick up in risk of cancer incidence. Very small. Again, not saying if your doctor told you to take calcium, just talk to your doctor. But like, it, really just showing the limited value of supplementation as like nutritional insurance. Again, I think there's lots of like situations where supplementation can be valuable most of the time, other than like way overdoing calcium from supplements. It doesn't appear to be harmful, right? It's not making things worse.
Yeah.
But like if you're spending, let's say, $20 a month on your bottle of vitamins, and that's cheap ones, right?
Right.
What else could you spend that $20 on?
Yeah.
Like how much, like, let's just say we went to the freezer section and we got some frozen vegetables, right? I could probably get like 5 of those jumbo bags
Yeah.
of frozen vegetables. And if we're lucky enough to be able to find something on sale, we're getting even more, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
and just think about the nutritional difference that upping vegetable intake. We were able to, with that $20, get an extra 2 servings of vegetables per day by buying the cheapest ones, but like they all count. Those 2 servings of vegetables per day is going to reduce all-cause mortality risk by something like 15%. We get about a 25% reduction once we get to 3 to 5 servings of vegetables per day. Like that's a huge benefit.
Yeah.
So what else could we spend that $20 on? If you've got the $20,
It's not going to hurt anything.
it's, like it's not going to hurt anything. Just don't way overdo the calcium. That's like, get enough calcium. Don't go way over, because it also increases risk of kidney stones. But yeah, I just think it really emphasizes the value of a food-based approach.
Similar question, maybe the reverse. There's so much out there now, and you talked about the microbiome of the stomach. What about when people have excess of these things? I hear a lot now about, minerals as an example.
Mm-hmm.
That's a thing. Like a lot of these functional medicine practitioners are finding now in their studies and pointing to that as a root cause to a lot of problems. Do you buy into that?
So we're really talking about heavy metals in this case.
We are.
So there's funnily enough, because there's a piece of your question that is talking about tolerable upper limits, which I think is really important. But the second piece of it is sort of talking about like heavy metals, pollutants, right? Like the toxins. I mean, there's definitely a vulnerable population that doesn't have as efficient detoxification pathways as most of us have. Where a smaller amount of pollutants can potentially be contributing to health harm. So if your doctor has done legitimate testing, a lot of the testing done by alternative practitioners is not. But if your doctor's done legitimate testing and has been able to do, some chelation therapy and has been able to, improve your symptoms, you're like, that's a good experiment, right?
Yeah.
I have the test result showing it was high. I did the treatment. I got it low.
I feel
I have
better.
the test results showing it's low, and I feel better, right?
Yeah.
That's scientific. I think a lot of the time it's snake oil, but not all the time. Like, I mean, it definitely does happen. There's lots of case studies of people with, high levels of exposures to things. But I think there's a lot of fear of heavy metals in the food supply, right? Mercury in seafood, cadmium in chocolate, lead and, lentils, right? Like it's, there's a lot of fear. And what that misses is how much of those foods you have to eat to actually be a problem.
Yes.
For most people, again, like there's a vulnerable population, and that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about most people on average.
Yeah.
It's quite a lot, right? And with the mercury in seafood, most seafood has more selenium than mercury, and the selenium binds up with the mercury in the fish and makes it unable to be absorbed in our bodies, so it protects us. So you don't even need to worry about that mercury, even if it's higher, if there's more selenium. With the chocolate, I did the math on dark chocolate because it has higher lead and cadmium levels. And you basically have to eat 9 to 13 ounces per day. So like 3 of those big dark chocolate, like Lindt chocolate bars every single day to hit the chronic reference doses. So you can it is possible. Like, there's studies that show that especially people with lower socioeconomic status do exceed the acceptable daily intake levels for food dyes, right? Like it is possible with our food supply to get too much of things that are harmful in too high quantities. It's one of the reasons why I talk about dietary diversity. So it both sort of protects us from pollutants, right? So in my choice of desserts, I'm not going to consume 9 ounces of chocolate per day. I'm going to mix it up, right? I'm going to have some different delicious things to eat. It's not all going to be dark chocolate. But there are a few foods where you can hit too high levels of nutrients. So it's not just pollutants, but it is possible to have too high levels of essential nutrients and hit toxicity levels. Not every nutrient. So some nutrients don't have what's called a tolerable upper limit, but a lot of them do. So like vitamin A, D, and E do. Vitamin K doesn't. Which is fascinating because it's also fat soluble. A lot of the minerals do. There's only a few foods that we really need to be careful of because they're so nutritious. We can overdo some nutrients. So Brazil nuts have so much selenium, 175% of the daily value per nut.
Per nut.
That 10 Brazil nuts per day, every single day, could hit chronic selenium toxicity levels. 10 once in a while is fine. Like half a bag once in a while is fine. Like that's fine. But every day consistently could hit too high selenium. One of the earliest symptoms of which is garlic breath without the garlic.
That's interesting.
Which is a fun one. And then later symptoms are like your hair and fingernails falling out. So not fun. Too much liver can hit too high levels of vitamin A and copper. So as much as like 2 servings per day. So a serving is 3 ounces cooked, can give you too much vitamin A and too much copper.
Who's doing that?
You don't frequent the same circles on the internet that I do. There's a group. And seaweeds, so especially kelp, can have so much iodine that even a serving per day can hit iodine toxicity, and that can harm your thyroid. So like there are these 3 foods that are so nutrient dense. We just want to be careful of how much of those we are consuming. Most of the time when you see nutrient toxicity, it's through supplementation, which is the other challenge, right? Like that you can't overdo. I mean, even B vitamins, they don't have a tolerable upper limit, but there have been more case reports now of people doing those like energy drinks that have tons of B vitamins, or the like electrolyte drinks that are packed full of B vitamins and actually getting extremely ill.
It sounds like all of those are kind of edge cases. They're just not the norm.
Yes. Whether we're talking about too high levels of essential nutrients or talking about pollutants, there was something unusual that happened there is always the case.
Good to know. Well, it's funny. We started this saying that, we were going to keep it to a certain period of time. And we, of course, well exceeded that. But I could talk to you for 5 hours because you obviously have tons of research and have a bunch of knowledge. Thank you so much for sharing some of it with us and for being so vulnerable and transparent with your journey, because I think that means a lot to people. And we will put your links out there. Folks, the book is Nutrivore. Go out there and grab a copy because all of this goodness, all of this information is in there in a digestible format if you're interested in this topic at all. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Message in the Middle with Marianne. If you enjoyed the podcast, please take a minute to share it and write a review, as it helps bring new listeners to our audience. If you'd like to keep the conversation going between episodes, please join us at Facebook group Message in the Middle with Marianne.